4/5 of it is below the surface, so I think we still have got the best yet to come. And again, I'd just like to congratulate the city and Mayo for what we've done. I think we've accomplished quite a bit in this short period of time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Susan, yes.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, wrong body. I just gave you a promotion, City Council President, Mr. Staver. Thank you very much for that update. And I commend the city for moving so quickly with plans in place to support DMC expansion. One of the legislation's intent back in 2013, when DMC legislation was passed to create DMC Corporation, was that the women and minority-owned firms will have maximal opportunities to participate in public works type of projects where the DMC dollars are being used. Could you help us understand what efforts are being made with respect to that end?
Thank you.
Sure, and very much a part of our thinking as we go forward. Any of the public projects that come forward, we do very much include a component in our contractual arrangements and requests for proposals to look at women and minority business ownership and make sure that they are participating. One of the areas that we struggle with, I think, is in some cases, given that we try to emphasize some of the local businesses and so forth, we struggle at times to find enough businesses of women and minority ownership to participate in that process. So what we do is we're trying to find ways to go out and more actively solicit some of those inquiries and submittals of proposals as these projects come forward. For the most part, the projects we're talking about here have been privately financed, but we nevertheless include that as part of our discussion, women and minority-owned businesses and their participation in these projects. But very much so as we pursue public-funded projects, we very definitely have a bit more emphasis. But I will say we do struggle at times to find a good diverse mix of applicants to the pool.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Please.
This question is towards Ms. Lamb. Does the DMCC regulation or legislation specifically say local women or minority projects, local minority and women-owned businesses? Does it include also statewide? Is there any specificity around this? And perhaps if it takes too long time to look that up, we'll wait until the next meeting to get that answer.
Kathleen, Kathleen is looking through the statute. Though my hypothesis is that it specifically calls out women and minority-owned businesses, and that our board has also encouraged a focus on local businesses, but those are not. Is that right, Kathleen?
Madam Chair, the statute specifies the employment of women and members of minority communities. And it's for all public infrastructure projects that the city undertakes. They must make every effort to hire and cause a construction manager, if a construction manager is there, to employ women and members of minority communities.
So am I hearing that that is local only or statewide?
Oh, it's.
Madam Chair, it doesn't specify. It can be both or either.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
I have no more questions.
Thank you. Any other questions on this topic? Mayor Brady.
I would just thank President Staver for saying what we struggle with often, and in administration, this is brought up over and over, and as Randy mentioned, it is a challenge for us, but it's not that it gets brushed aside. We are continually working on that to see how we can do better.
Good. I'll just suggest Kathleen can help us keep track of this, that we should have a follow-up conversation on this. I know that at the state we are working very hard to expand, and we're finding much better success because of some very specific strategies that we're putting in place to be able to work with women and minority-owned businesses. And maybe we could, there might be some best practices there.
That'd be good.
We don't know everything by any means either, but I appreciate you raising the issue, Susan. Yes,
All right.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next item on the City of Rochester report is the transportation management update. To welcome, we got, great, Gary Newman and Ken Holte. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm Gary Newman. I work for the city. Ken Holte works for a firm called SRF. We hired them last October as kind of like an augment group for our staff. They will act as the city staff to help supervise construction and hire other consultant firms that will do a number of major studies that still need to be completed in the area of transportation and transit. Studies on transit, parking, the bike loop, street capacity, and a transit management association. And so Ken will be following me. I would note that what this is leading towards is hiring a number of consultants for those studies, quite a few consultant firms. Those that will be hired will have to meet a WMBE requirement. We've discussed that. It'll be part of their contract for the firms that are selected. I'm going to give you an overall, kind of a brief look at DMC funding and how the funding and the cost for transit fit into the picture, because it's probably the biggest component of the expenditures that are likely to occur for the DMCC. The DMC legislation, I'll be real brief on some of these, is $585 million. There's $455 million in what they call general state infrastructure aid, which is $327 million from the state, has to be matched by $128 million by the city. The city has, as you know, approved a new quarter-cent sales tax to pay for the city's share of that $128 million share. State transit aid, there's an additional $116 million in state transit aid, $70 million from the state. The county's matching that with $46 million. And then there's some sales tax exemptions of $14 million. Those all should total up to $585 million. The city cost through from 2013 to 2015 is $9.8 million, plus the costs that we're incurring in this year's budget, $4.2 million for the DMC EDA budget, $5.5 million for the Chateau Theater, totaling $19.5 million. This does not include, Mayo also provided some funding for the EDA, they provided some funding for the Chateau Theater, and it does not include the CIP funding that is in the 2016 budget. As far as the state aid, because we're not quite at the $200 million threshold, but I'm sure we will go over it in this year, 2016. We haven't received any state aid or state transit aid. But with the city contributions at $19.5 million, we basically have like an IOU from the state that they will, when we meet that point, they'll owe us $49.7 million. That does not come all at once. It is basically totaled on, like for the first $100 million over $200 million, the city would get $2.75 million annually thereafter for X period of years, and then it will increase as you go from $300 million to $400 million. In the DMC development plan, they tried to estimate all the infrastructure costs for the things that are shown in the plan and identified in the plan. And basically, it said that there's $1.8 billion in costs over 20 years, averaging about $90 million a year for that period. Obviously, a lot of those are back-end loaded when you get into the transit and transportation parking improvements such as that. That amount includes developer and federal funds in there, so it's kind of an overall bucket of costs. But as you can see, probably the largest component of those costs are in the area of transit, transportation, parking. Parking, it shows a need for 16,000 new parking structures. Actually, that totals 22,000 because you're taking out vacant surface lots now, replacing them with ramps in some cases. So that's a lot of parking. And there's a circulator in there, which cost $348 million for 2 phases. And then there's other things you need to do with the transit system, the streets, and the city loop, totaling $112 million. So as you can see, in that estimate, there was over $1 billion just for the things that are in the areas of transportation and transit. These systems, and this should say TTP rather than TPP, they're all interrelated. If you do a new circulator, as you know, the plan assumes some peripheral lots that people have to park in, so you're building those, and then people are coming downtown on some kind of a circulator. So those two have to work together. And in addition, if you put a circulator on some streets, It will affect the capacity of those streets. So you have to, also, you have to be very careful and study all that. As you can tell, some of these costs will likely exceed the revenues available, and the board will have to do some prioritization and some phasing. The board's already done that. They've prioritized for this year the heart of the city and Discovery Square and transit, and we're trying to move ahead. This discussion is on the third of those, the transit and the remaining interrelated pieces. Obviously, with this size of expenditures, these are about the largest public infrastructure decisions that will be faced by the city of Rochester. The two largest projects we've done in the last 30 years have been redoing Highway 52, which was a little over $200 million, and the flood control project, which was $125 million. So these are all in that neighborhood or greater in terms of cost. So the plan assumed that there would be a number of studies that needed to be finished off. There's a whole federal process you have to go through to try and access the federal funding, and Ken will get into the details of some of those studies. But obviously, federal funding is going to be a key to things like the circulator. And one of the biggest things we have to do is make sure as we do that, we'll try and do it as quickly as we can, but it also has to be very thorough so people understand the capital costs and also the operating costs for these items, because as I've indicated, there will be some significant costs involved. In addition to the infrastructure, there's certain other things like a transportation management association. That's to try and use the parking much better, kind of have a system to promote people to switch to a different mode instead of individual vehicles and to a transit system. A study will have to be looked at on that, and also developing incentives to move people to that. So there's basically 5 studies or thereabouts that have to be conducted. They have to be done very expeditiously, but we still have to do them in a framework in which we make sure that people have all the information they need on what the costs are, both for operating and capital, and pick the best systems that work for Rochester that we can manage. And I'll turn it over with that to Ken.
Thank you, Gary. So I believe in your packets, there's a compilation of some of our monthly progress reports that we've been developing from the program management side to identify the various work that we do each month. All that really initially set up to really what happened in the month of March, which is really a huge milestone for us. In early March, on March 2nd and 3rd, we held a 2-day event where we brought in multiple firms who had responded to the original program management RFP to discuss the transit and transportation components in the studies, to understand what had been done and look at the larger picture of the coordination of all these elements. As Gary just alluded to, there are 5 primary areas that we need to look at. There's the transportation management of everything that would go on downtown, the parking, the transit component, streets, and then also the bike and pedestrian facilities both in and around the DMC district. So looking at those 5 core areas and how they work not independently but as a unified transportation program was a big deal. Our event that we held in early March was quite successful. We had a couple of good days of very good conversation, identification of tasks and need, and how and where we can expedite these studies. And so we have since developed a summary of all those components so that we can use that information to drive towards scopes of work to hire additional consultants, and I'm going to get to that here in a minute. From this study, we then developed a statement of qualifications that we submitted or posted out in the middle of March, and solicited responses to those statements of qualifications. We did receive 7 submittals as of the end of March on the 31st. Since that time, we have been able to evaluate those submittals, and just as of last week, had a selection meeting to discuss these submittals with the city and target who we want to hire specifically for these studies. Each of these core areas that we just mentioned are, at this level, are very highly skilled areas. There's some big picture thinking. There's some long-range planning. This is not for the average Joe, so to speak. And so we're looking at representing the city, we're looking to identify the best of the best to make sure that we're putting together a good and comprehensive plan as we move forward, as well as being stewards of the public's money to make sure that it's being applied in an appropriate fashion. And based on the information that we developed from our transportation event on March 2 and 3, the information we got from the SOQs and the suggestions we received and the responses to those SOQs, and building upon the DMC plan, the foundation of what the goals and the objectives are to be, we think we've got an excellent opportunity now to move forward into the scoping and the budgeting to get these studies rolling and get these consultants contracted and underway. As Gary had alluded to earlier, there are a lot of high-level pieces that go into these, particularly when you start looking at the transit component to this and what the transit piece or circulator and the overall combination of events here. So looking at long-term operational assessments and the engineering costs and putting them in the right position at the right times to spend money effectively and efficiently. Also understanding just the overall financial plan of implementing these projects and understanding the cash flow that will be needed to complement how the funding will arrive, but also to implement then projects to be put into the ground. We wish to also build off of what the EDA has done so far from a public engagement standpoint. They've built a messaging system and have engaged the public throughout the development of the DMC plan, which has been very effective. And so as individual projects start to come online, and these studies would be considered individual projects, we want to continue that momentum and build upon what the EDA has built already as well. Of course, with any infrastructure project that you put in, there's always an environmental component. And even though you might think the downtown area is a very urbanized area, there aren't maybe necessarily rural type environmental pieces, there are environmental requirements that we'll need to make, documents that we will need to create and get approvals on to make sure all this flows through effectively. And that is just, all in the planning of the timing, the financing, and the coordination of one project to the next. And along with that then is just the organizational component of these studies, getting them coordinated, having them overseen in a manner that promotes approvals from regulatory agencies, make sure that we've got the right ideas being vetted and that we meet the regulatory requirements to regain our approvals. And so we're setting all that up as well. From the standpoint of where we go, we talked about scoping and budgeting for these to hire the consultants that we're about to select. There are still several major decisions that these studies will be driving towards. What is the circulator mode and the routes? Where exactly will they be? The DMC development plan to date has a lot of good objectives, goals, ideas, thoughts on paper. Now it's time to start putting some specifics to those. And so it's driving towards those decisions of actually defining what it will be and where it will help us define what the costs are and how they operate. So along with that, those major decisions are the locations of the parking. Gary talked about the number of stalls, where the ramps, location, close to transit stations, where they're going to be, big decisions. The downtown street operations, how much vehicular traffic, and it isn't so much just vehicular traffic, it's moving people. So looking beyond just the vehicular component of what happens in the downtown area, but how do people get to one place to another is a big piece of the downtown area. And then looking at really a lot of the reshaping of the downtown, from the parking to getting from A to B is a big piece. And this will expand and really have to evolve into a long-term evolution of what the city's transit network and system is really going to be. It has a current system now that works for what's there today, but certainly we're looking at some much larger numbers of people over a long range of time that we need to build towards. You're not going to build this all at once. You build up and you ramp up for the long-term goal. And so the evolution of the city's transit system is another piece of the major decision making that we'll be doing as we go forward there. And then last but not least, as Gary also touched to, as much funding as there is that we know of to date, there also is a great deal of need. And so we will be looking to pursue as much federal funding as we can to help provide for the expenses of these projects, particularly as it relates to transit. That's a huge expenditure. So this graphic that we have here on the board is really what we've viewed as probably a bit of an expedited Federal Transit Authority schedule. So at a minimum there, you're looking at about 9 or 10 years to get from where we are today to where you're building something in construction. Again, you can do some things in pieces, but there are certain designated steps that you need to get requirements on, to get approvals before you go to the next step. And the FTA is very specific in those rules and regulations, and we want to make sure that we're doing this in the manner that we meet all those so that we can acquire as many federal funds as possible.
Thank you. I'm sure we have questions here.
Yes, Madam Chair, I have
Yes.
a few questions of Mr. Holte.
Please
Thank
go
you.
forth.
Mr. Holte, thank you very much for that report, most comprehensive, and you have the unenviable task of trying to envision what the city will look like some 50 years from now, so then you can plan ahead what kind of transportation you need to have, how to finance it, how to move the passengers, the patients, and the visitors, the cars, the bicyclists, and et cetera. In the interest of full disclosure, I'd like to say that SRF has been my consultant, as well as we have been SRF's sub-consultant in the past for the last 15 years. And it's been a good working relationship. So with that, I understand that you've had 9 hours, March 2nd and March 3rd, a transit summit at a place in Minneapolis. Was this meeting public or private, Mr. Holte?
The invitees consisted of the firms that had responded to the initial program management RFP that the city received.
How many of those experts were women or minority, or the firms?
There were a number of women in the room. I'd have to think about that to do a head count. As far as minority representation for firms, I do not believe there were any.
Okay.
Yes, there were.
Were there? Okay.
The other question I have is, do you expect those that were in this private meeting to then respond to cities' RFPs that you're sending out?
Certainly can. There will be a number of RFPs that come out, certainly over the course of this, yes.
So would not those firms that were at the meeting at the Transit Summit on March 2nd and 3rd have competitive advantage over others that might not have attended the meeting?
I don't believe that would be correct. As I mentioned earlier, the current studies that we're looking at are pretty specialized. And not to discount that a minority firm could not have that specialty, but I don't believe so, no.
If I could,
I respectfully beg to differ, because there are some small firms that are minority and women-owned that have worked for international companies that have experience from San Francisco, London, and other places that are big and small. And they have very specialized skill as well. So I respectfully differ and would encourage you to expand your search.
if I could just comment, the way this was structured was, back when the city retained the program management firm, which is Ken's firm, that was a publicly advertised process, and because it involves a very large, these are all very large studies, the people that responded to that were, I think, some of the largest firms in the state of Minnesota. And then, basically, this was a continuation of that, where those firms were then the ones brought in for the summit. Now, I will say that, as I mentioned earlier, as the process moves forward, and this has been discussed previously between SRF and the city, all of the contractors that get some of this work, and there are a lot of large firms, they all will be required to have to meet the women and minority participation guidelines, both on the contractor basis and on the employment basis. And so that'll be part of whatever contract. So in a lot of cases, they haven't identified specifically those firms at this point, but they will be required to identify them before we'll enter into a contract with them.
Ms. Ronnie?
Madam Chair,
Please.
I have one more question. Thank you very much to that answer. My question is, Mr. Holte, December, January, February, now it's March, and I looked through your meeting minutes and accomplishments, and I commend you for a great detail with which you've thoughtfully managed the work breakdown structures of which program goes before another, program management. I'm wondering if I missed something in terms of how you would engage, again, women and minority-owned firms. I did not see anything that says how you would go about tapping into those talents that are within women and minority companies in any of the strategies that you've set out for us in your meeting minutes. Perhaps I've missed something. Would you point that out to me if I missed it?
Mr. Holte.
Certainly. So within the, I believe within the reports, there are some commentary about developing our WMBE program. One of the initial tasks that the city set us on was to develop how we would actually implement this and tackle that very task. And so we are in the process currently of we had I'd say, larger expounded list of agencies that we wanted to meet. We have been discussing that at great length to understand what's the best way to do this. There's the WMBE requirements that are in the state statute are pretty good numbers that we need to meet, and so we want to tackle these in the right way. Currently, our methodology is that we've identified about 4 or 5 agencies that we wish to sit down with one-on-one to get their lessons learned, what has worked to encourage firms to participate in these types of projects, what has worked to bring them on board and to garner that interest and to engage these types of firms. We certainly don't have any issue with being specific to WMBE firms participating in any of these projects. So at the current moment, that's a little bit still under development. There's been a big impetus on let's get up and go. So with respect to these initial projects, we're basically going to be following the initial state statute and the WMBE requirements have been laid out. We hope to develop a larger, grander program and to your specific comment for future work as well.
Madam Chair.
Ms. Ronnie.
I just have one last comment to make, and that is, as state taxpayers and as this body, we often think that when women and minority business participation is an add-on. I think we need to begin to think about the construction cost as being a requirement element of meeting successful criteria. Successful criteria includes quality, budget, schedule, and encouraging and meeting women and minority-owned business goals. These are not a separate issue that's an add-on, but it should be viewed holistically. You don't give up schedule to increase additional funding. You don't give up quality to get to the schedule. I think it should be viewed holistically that quality, schedule, and budget and participation are all key factors, equal key factors to our success.
Thank you. Mr. Newman?
Yes, Madam Chair. One more thing that we have been looking into and is on our list, and that's how in some cases do you break it. This applies not just kind of overall, including the construction projects. How do you break up projects into smaller components? Whether we should do something to, in some cases, provide a simpler method for companies to bond for projects so that we can attract more women and minority business contractors. We have a list of things that we've gotten from 2 different consultant firms that are things that we're looking into. And some of the meetings that we're planning on having with people in the cities who have a lot more experience at this than we do are to discuss those kinds of things. What other tools did they use to get more participation? And so those are things that we are actively looking into. We didn't have it as a topic for today, but this is something that we have been working on and we will continue to be working on.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments on this? Mayor Brady?
Thanks for the
Thank you,
report.
Susan.
Mr. Holte, I would ask, and one of the comments that came up in the presentation was, what's the current capacity, or how will whatever we do impact the capacity of our current roads? I happen to be one that from way back before DMC, I was kind of impressed with the PRT, the whole thing, Taxi 2000, whatever